You're watching a Hanford Communities issue briefing, highlighting important environmental cleanup issues at the U.S. Department of Energy's Hanford Site in southeastern Washington, issues affecting citizens of the Pacific Northwest and the nation. The Hanford Communities organization was established in 1994 and is comprised of the communities surrounding the Hanford Site, forming one voice to advise the Department of Energy on important transition and cleanup issues.
Hi, and welcome to another issue of the Hanford Communities Issue Briefing. I'm Rob Roxburgh. In our program today, we'll discuss the final tank closure and waste management environmental impact statement, or EIS. This is an important document that helps shape the future of Hanford cleanup. The 586 square mile Hanford site, located just north of the Tri-Cities in Washington State, produced 2/3 of the plutonium for our nation's nuclear arsenal. The site has made its mark on history, building and operating the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor that fueled the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, ending World War II, supplying plutonium throughout the Cold War, and then, as a result of operating for 43 years, becoming the largest environmental cleanup project in the United States. This challenging project, projected to cost $112 billion, began in 1989 and will continue until at least 2050. The agencies involved in this cleanup, the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the Washington State Department of Ecology, have moved 12 million tons of contaminated soil away from the Columbia River, treated groundwater for 20 years, reducing more than 100 square miles of contamination, began retrieval of waste from single-shell tanks in Hanford's Sea Farm, and entombed 7 of Hanford's 9 nuclear reactors in concrete for safe storage as the radioactivity decays. The Tri-Party Agreement signed in 1989 marked the end of production and the beginning of Hanford cleanup. This agreement and the 2010 consent decree that reset the schedule for treating waste in underground tanks provide a roadmap and an itinerary for Hanford cleanup, directions for where we need to go and how and when we need to get there. But fog surrounded parts of this cleanup route. Decision makers couldn't be sure about the consequences for future generations. The EIS provides clarity regarding how various waste disposal practices will affect future people, wildlife, and the environment they depend on for survival. The EIS also considers the cumulative effects of various cleanup decisions so that decision makers know how individual choices will affect the entire ecosystem. Important decisions have been made about removing the 56 million gallons of waste from Hanford's 177 underground tanks and treating it at the waste treatment plant. Equally important decisions lie ahead about how to retrieve, treat, and dispose of the waste. Now, today our panelists will discuss the final EIS, which provides preferred alternatives for future Hanford cleanup decisions. So now let's turn the time over to our panelists. They are Mary Beth Barant, National Environmental Policy Act Document Manager for the U.S. Department of Energy Office of River Protection, and Suzanne Dahl, the Tank Waste Treatment Section Manager for the Washington Department of Ecology. Welcome.
Well, thank you for asking Suzanne and I to come and speak to you today on the final tank closure and waste management EIS. You know, if you had unlimited time and resources, you could plan a trip across the country. You wouldn't have to check a map, road conditions, wouldn't have to think about where you were going to stop. You would just go. But most of us probably don't do that. In many ways, for the environment, an EIS is that environmental roadmap. It's a document that's done early in the process, before the decisions are made, to help an agency sort out what kind of things they have to consider. So I'm going to talk today about what are the landmarks or the preferred alternative choices that we evaluated in the tank closure and waste management EIS. And there's a couple big programmatic decisions. I'm just going to touch on them today. rather large area of programmatic decisions lies with the 177 tanks out at Hanford. So in 1997, DOE made a decision in another EIS, it was called the Tank Waste Remediation EIS, to retrieve the waste from the single shell tanks and to treat them in the waste treatment plant. So you may have heard of the waste treatment plant, it's under construction right now. So those were the decisions we made then, but we didn't make all the decisions that we needed to in 1997. So one of the things we did in the tank closure EIS is we again looked at this retrieval question. How much waste could we get out of the single shell tanks? And what were going to be the impacts if various waste was left in the tanks? So we evaluated options like leaving 1% of the waste in the tanks, 0.1%, 10%, and then what would happen if you left all the waste in the tanks. And what we found was a little bit surprising. What we found is even leaving 10% of the waste in the tanks still had an environmental impact. So we looked at whether we could mitigate that by putting a better barrier over the top or doing something more as we closed the tanks, and we found that really didn't help us much. So in the end, we reconfirmed the decision that was made in 1997 and said that we needed to retrieve 99% of the waste out of the single shell tanks. And that's what's in our tri-party agreement. Another area that we sort of made the decision in 97 to defer or look at later was what additional treatment capacity did we need to support the waste treatment plant. The original plant wasn't designed to treat all the waste. And so the question was, what additional capacity would we need to do? And in there, we looked at 4 technologies. We looked at building another low-activity waste plant, something that looked very similar to what we're building out there today. We looked at bulk vitrification, which is the same concept in a smaller unit, smaller throughput. We looked at cast stone. You may know that as grout. That's a more common term. And we looked at building a grout facility. And then we looked at a new process, which was steam reforming. At this point, DOE decided that we're not ready to make a decision on additional treatment capacity. It's probably one of the key areas where the state and DOE don't agree. And you're going to hear more from that from Suzanne, I'm sure. Other things that we looked at were facilities needed to support the waste treatment plant. So there are a lot of things you need to run the plant. You need evaporating capacity. You need disposal capacity. We looked at additional tank space. Lots of infrastructure, transfer lines, upgrades to things. So those are the type of things that you also evaluate in an EIS. Another area we looked at was the waste that comes from treating waste in the waste treatment plant. It's a term we call secondary waste. And it's one of the things that going into the EIS evaluation, we suspected we were going to see it show up as a problem. It wasn't an area the department had spent a lot of attention or energy on. And sure enough, in our evaluation, we said we need to do something better with that waste form prior to disposal. Disposal is one of the key areas that we looked at in the EIS as well. We got a lot of press and a lot of attention about waste coming from other DOE facilities to be disposed of at Hanford, which is a decision the department is deferring. But just as important to the region here is we really had to look at what were we going to do with all the waste that we generated from our activities on site. So we looked at all the disposal facilities and all the capacity we would need to do that. And then another question we deferred in 1997 was, how are we going to close the single shell tanks? So we have 149 single shell tanks that after we retrieve the waste from the tanks have to be closed in some manner. So we looked at clean closure, which is sort of a fancy regulatory word for digging up the tanks and the equipment around them, and all the contaminated soil. And then we also looked at what if we retrieve the waste out of the tanks, left the tank structure in place, and looked at treatment methods for contaminated soil associated with that. So for that major piece, we decided that we were going to leave the tank structure in place after retrieval, but we would look at the extent of soil contamination that we have, and we would factor that in through the RCRA permitting process as we go to close those tanks. So what the EIS does is it kind of tells you what are some potential pitfalls out there. What are some things that an agency needs to pay attention to as they go along their decision-making process? One of the misconceptions that I think people have is at the end of the process, you write a record of decision. It says this is what the agency is going to go do. And a lot of people viewed that as the end of the process, when really it is what we think of as the beginning. Because a lot of the facilities are going to need permits, and we'll have to go to Ecology, we'll have to get permits for them, they'll go out for public comment. So this won't be the last time you hear the two agencies address issues as we move forward. So thank you. Suzanne?
Certainly want to thank you for the gracious time that you all are providing us today to talk about this really important document. It's hard to get excited about a really important document, about a document like this, but it's been a long time in coming. It has a lot of great information in it. And just as someone who's probably reviewed every single page almost in the document, how many volumes are there? There's quite a few volumes. I want to tell you that the single best thing about this document is that it does a really honest job of calculating what the risks are that are proposed from various alternatives as we move forward. And I certainly think that the Department of Energy and its contractor that did this environmental impact statement should be really commended for their very honest approach to this scientific endeavor of getting that information out for all of us, you and the decision makers. We served as a cooperating agency on this document, which meant that that Department of Ecology was involved along the way from the data gathering stage all the way through draft and final. And we felt that the processes were really transparent and that we were able to influence things where we needed to. And it's an important analysis that gives us information, as Mary Beth did a good job of describing, so that we can go into the future and use it as a guiding map to help us understand, if you make this decision, this is the environmental impact. If you make a slightly different decision, this is the environmental impact. And so in some key areas, so waste management, there's a tremendous amount of waste that's either currently disposed of at Hanford or will be disposed of in the future at Hanford. And one of the things that the environmental impact statement tells us is that that any waste forms that we put in the ground need to be the most robust waste forms that we can make, so that it's environmentally protective in the future. It looked at various options, and it said, and if you look at the data, you can tell that the more robust waste forms are not only just a nice thing to have, but they're a necessary thing to have to protect the environment. It also gives you the indication that Hanford is pretty much chock full of waste, and that we're at the point of exceeding the ability to safely manage and store that waste and keep it where it needs to be. And so that gets to the question of, can Hanford accept off-site waste? Can waste from other sites, other Department of Energy sites, come to Hanford? And the EIS, if you look at the data in it, it's pretty clear that we can't really accept any other risk burden from any other sites, that we've got enough here, and it's going to be a challenge just to manage the waste that we do have. And the other thing that the environmental impact statement did from a waste management standpoint is it looked at everything from a cumulative standpoint. So all the decisions were set against the backdrop of the waste that already existed here. And so what that gives you is a really nice, I like to call it a risk budget tool, but it gives you the ability to say, if I add this much more waste in this waste form, and I add it to all the other waste that's disposed, am I going to be exceeding standards in the future, or am I not going to be exceeding standards? And so I think one of the lessons that this environmental impact statement gives us is that we need to look at things from that cumulative standpoint and compare it against what's already here. As far as tank closure, and Mary Beth did a good job of addressing this, it's not, what we found by doing the EIS is that it's not the tanks, the shells of the tanks themselves that create a problem. It's what's in the tanks and also what's leaked out the bottom of the tanks, or what might leak out in the future from the bottom of the tanks. And so what you find is whether you take the tank shells out after you've retrieved all the waste out of the tanks, that doesn't so much change the environmental impact. What changes the environmental impact is how much of the waste you get out of the tank to begin with, how much of the waste has already leaked to the ground, and how much waste might leak to the ground in the future while we're getting this job done. Those are the key things that impact the environment from a tank closure standpoint. And then to go on to talk about tank waste treatment. So the EIS does this environmental impact statement, does a good job of letting us all know that what I think we all already know, that we need to finish building the waste treatment plant. It's got a large pretreatment facility, a high-level vitrification or glassification facility, and a low-activity vitrification facility. And the purpose of these combined facilities is to take the tank waste, the 56 million gallons, separate it into a high-level form and a low-activity form, vitrify it, immobilize it in a really solidified glass form that keeps the constituents from getting into the environment again. And the high-level waste goes off to a deep geologic repository. The low-activity waste, which turns out to be 90% of the volume, stays at Hanford and is buried in a near-surface landfill. And it's buried above the state's groundwater. The groundwater goes to the Columbia River. So the next thing that the environmental impact statement looked at is, well, what's the best waste form? They're already building a low-activity vitrification facility, but as Mary Beth pointed out, the whole system isn't big enough to get the whole job done. And just to put that into perspective for you, if you build a second low-activity treatment system and you run it in concert with the waste treatment plant, will get done by the 2047 timeframe. If you don't build that low-activity treatment system, we're going to be treating waste till the 2080 timeframe. So obviously that's not acceptable. The tanks aren't going to last that long. So it's clear that we need to build that second low-activity treatment system. So in the EIS, that's one thing it tells us really clearly. The next thing it tells us really clearly as far as that goes is, what does that waste form need to be? Well, the Department of Ecology and the state has had a commitment that needs to be glass. We've had that commitment since the late 1980s, and that's what we think it needs to be. The Department of Energy is sort of held out at different times for the idea that there's maybe something that's faster or cheaper that might be as protective. So what this environmental impact statement was supposed to do is look at all of those things, see if they are as environmentally protective, see if anything turns out to be cheaper. And what the data within the EIS tells you is that actually none of those other waste forms are as protective as glass to our groundwater and to the eventual groundwater users 200, 300 to thousands of years from now who will be using the groundwater in this area. And so what you find is that in order to protect those people, you need to immobilize all the low activity waste that's going to stay here at Hanford in a robust waste form. And the waste form that gives you the environmental protection that you need is vitrification. And the other options that they look at fall short and actually don't protect the environment. And in addition, it looked at a cost analysis and found out that they were all about cost mutual. You know, there's always this idea that we can maybe grout things faster and cheaper, but when you look at the actual analysis of it, it turns out that everything's about cost mutual. So that gives you the idea that shouldn't be a deciding factor. And so then those are the main areas that the EIS gives us information on. Now, and I wanted to reiterate that we agreed with most of the preferred alternatives, all but one, and we agreed with all of the analysis that was done, and it actually are very complimentary of it and think that it's robust in its nature. Where we are sort of a little bit at a disconnect is the Department of Energy's viewpoint to not make a decision on the supplemental treatment, the additional tank waste treatment. We think there's more than enough information in the EIS to make that decision. We think that there's nothing within the EIS that tells you should make a different decision. In fact, there's lots of information that tells you to make a decision and to make it soon and not to delay it. So that's kind of the concern we have, is that to get to the very end of this long EIS and to not make a decision on one of the key factors, which is how we treat 60 to 50% of the tank waste, it tells you that some other things may be in jeopardy. If we don't make a decision, I mean, people think that putting off a decision to the future is reserving your rights for the future to make a different decision, but in some cases it's actually making a decision. And so, and in this case, by putting it off, we might be making a decision to leave waste in tanks longer. We might be making a decision to treat waste for a lot longer, beyond the 2047 commitment. And so it's for those reasons that we're sort of concerned that we go ahead and move forward with that part of the decision. So I did want to reiterate that the EIS is a great tool. We have a lot of faith in the analysis that's in it, and I think that if we use it as a guiding force to move forward with, we can all collectively as decision makers make good, sound decisions that are protective of the environment.
All right, thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Mary Beth. We've heard from our experts. Now let's hear from you. We'll turn the time over to our audience for questions. I'll be coming around with a microphone. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll make my way down to you, all right?
Suzanne, this is a question for you. The EIS is I take it it's completed now, and many volumes, and we've heard it's 10,000 pages, and for the public, how could we get a synopsis of that or a summary of that EIS?
When I might ask Mary Beth to further answer the question, there's a good summary that's about this big, and so it's an easy read, and as far as how people can actually get it.
We brought some copies today on the back table. We've got a sign-up sheet. If you're not a hard copy person, it's also available on the Hanford website, and it comes up at the first page that you go to. So there's a big box in the left-hand corner. So if you like to read things electronically, I'm not so good with that. You can tell the age difference. You can go to the website and find it there.
So I think you answered part of the question. The remaining about the leaking double shell and single shell tanks, what options are considered in the environmental impact statement to address the leaks?
What the EIS does show, and you have to look a little bit for kind of the words we use to describe it. We did look at the impacts of past leaks, and then we did look at, we call them retrieval leak losses, releases from the tanks during retrieval. They also kind of give you an idea of what if a single shell tank were leaking. And what we found in those areas is both of those really do have an environmental impact. I think exactly where the department's going to go is a little bit uncertain, but We certainly saw that soil remediation, cleaning up of the contamination that's in the soil column before it can reach the groundwater, is really an area in which spending time and energy on that topic and developing technologies to look at that is really important. So, we'll have to see how things go with space. We certainly evaluated up to 84 new DSTs in the EIS, so I'm comfortable that we have the analysis there. We're just going to have to kind of walk ourselves through some of the decisions.
So I think some alternatives that are provided in the EIS, maybe not as classic alternatives, but the information is there, is what barriers do to help prevent infiltration and contaminants migrating. Certainly we have the coverage to be able to build new tanks if we need to do that. In addition, the EIS provided coverage for true tank retrievals if some of the waste were to be determined to be true. And the EIS also gave us the opportunity to look at other technologies that maybe could be deployed out in the field near tank farms. And if you juxtapose that against newly leaking tanks, maybe there's the potential there to highlight some of those high-risk tanks or tanks that are leaking and have them go directly to an immobilization technology like bulk vitrification, like other technologies that could be used right near the tank farms, and do that as a Band-Aid approach while we're building the waste treatment plant.
First of all, I want to commend you for the incredible amount of work that it takes to put together a document like this and the analysis and review that is needed to do this work. Thank you very much. As an engineer, I realize that there is a lot of technology out there, and that from what I've seen in the technology, there's nothing bad out there that we can't remedy. The difficulty seems to getting to that decision process, and you've laid the ground for that decision process, but it seems like making that decision, getting it made, is one of the more difficult things. How can we, as the public, as citizens of this area, how can we best influence the process to make that decision made to continue to move forward?
I think one place the public can have further influence is that when we go out for public comment on new permits, and that would be a follow along. And I certainly think there's always the opportunity to inform your congressional leaders of the continued need for remediation of all kinds at Hanford, and specifically for the tank waste issues and waste management issues.
All right, that's all the time that we have for today. If you'd like more information on the topic that we discussed today, be sure to visit the environmental impact section of the hanford.gov website. Finally, we'd like to thank our audience, the Richland Rotary, for their questions and participation today. We'd like to thank our panelists for their remarks, and we'd like to thank you for joining us. This has been another Hanford Communities Issue Briefing. We'll see you next time.
To find out how you can become more involved in this important regional issue, or to have a Hanford Communities speaker talk to your organization, contact the Hanford Communities at 509-942-7348, or by fax at 509-942-7379, or visit our website at www.ci.richland.wa.us.